Does this ever happen to you? You fondly remember a game you used to play as a kid, and now, years later, you're about to replay this amazing game that you spent entire summer vacations on. You boot up the game, dive back into this precious childhood memory, and it kind of blows now. Yeah, some games are best left in the past, preserved as a heartwarming memory rather than the clunky mess that the sands of time turned them into. But then there are games that almost have the opposite effect. You play them and you love them, but because you're a kid, maybe you don't realize just how amazing this game is until you revisit it as an adult. It is this exact experience that I had recently with the remastered version of Metroid Prime for the Nintendo Switch. Metroid Prime was first released on the Nintendo Gamecube all the way back in 2002, probably making the game older than some of you viewers, but at no point during my recent playthrough did this even seem believable. Sure, the upgraded visuals of this remaster do a lot to help hide its age, but it is the core gameplay in particular that, even in this day and age, stands out as being nothing short of otherworldly. I'd played Metroid Prime before, both on the Gamecube and the Wii, and don't get me wrong, I absolutely loved both this game and its sequels, but only after going back to Metroid Prime with the 2023 Switch version did I realize just how special this game was and still is. But why? Sometimes games stand the test of time because they set a new industry standard for a particular genre, or maybe they even invent a new type of game. Other times they are so far ahead of their time with their ideas or their technological prowess that it takes much longer for them to start showing signs of aging. Metroid Prime was a really good looking game for its time and it brought a ton of fresh ideas to the table, but at the time it's not like these features by themselves seemed so mind-blowing that we'd need years to wrap our heads around it all. Then what is it that made this game so future-proof? That's what we're going to try and find out today. We're going to take a closer look at Metroid Prime and analyze what made it such a unique game, why it aged better than many other games from that era, and what developers can learn from it if they also want to create a product that can stand the test of time. But before I continue, something that won't stand the test of time is this video if no one sees it. So if you end up liking what you see, consider the usual liking, subscribing and leaving a comment. Yeah, you know the drill, but it works, and now that we got it out of the way, I can continue yapping about Metroid Prime. You can get an idea of the unique nature of Metroid Prime when you try to describe it to someone who's never played it. Comparing it to other games doesn't really work. To this day, there aren't really any games that resemble Metroid Prime, other than the two home console sequels and a couple of handheld spin-offs it got. Even trying to put it into a category is not an easy task. When you look at the combat footage, you'd be inclined to think that it's a first-person shooter, but calling it an FPS does not really do it justice. It offers so much more than just shooting action that there are plenty of people out there who'd argue that it's not an FPS at all, but rather a first-person adventure game. I even asked you, my beloved audience, whether you consider Metroid Prime a first-person shooter or not, and while a lot of you said yes, it definitely wasn't unanimous. Personally, I'm on the fence about this, and I can see both sides of the argument. Yes, you're in first person and you shoot things, and yes, there's so much more to the game than that. In order to understand what Metroid Prime is like as a game, it's important to know the history of the franchise and also what the term Metroidvania means. I assume many of you already do, but I will briefly explain it for those who don't. Metroidvanias are games that, instead of letting you progress through separate levels or stages, take place in one giant interconnected overworld. To progress through the game, you need to explore this overworld, unlocking new items that in turn unlock access to new parts of areas that you'd previously explored. As you can probably guess, the name Metroidvania is a portmanteau of Metroid and Castlevania, the two franchises that popularized this type of design. Though in some ways similar, Metroidvanias differ from open world design, because progress through this world still follows a predetermined sequence. You need to move through the game in a specific order to reach the end, making the experience much more focused and linear than an open world with tons of side quests. It also relies a lot on backtracking, revisiting areas you've already explored before multiple times in order to find new things that you weren't able to access earlier. For example, in Metroid Prime, the final boss encounter is a 2-minute walk away from your initial landing zone on the overworld. But in order to get there, you'll need to make your way through 12 plus hours of content. As you go through this content, you'll also find weapons and other upgrades you need in order to beat increasingly tougher enemies. In this way, the overworld, while mostly remaining the same visually, evolves with the player, escalating the challenge to keep things interesting until the credits roll. The main challenge doesn't even come from enemies though, but from puzzles. Many rooms in Metroid contain a puzzle that you need to complete in order to find a secret item, unlock a new area, or even just be able to traverse without dying. The enemies you'll find in each area will often be a part of that puzzle, and progress rarely hinges on you just eliminating all the enemies and moving on. This is why there are people who have issues calling Metroid Prime an FPS, as you could argue that the FPS part ultimately isn't really the point of the game. The original Metroid games, which all used this design philosophy, were side-scrolling 2D games that looked and played a lot like the platformers of today. Most of Nintendo's other big franchises, such as Super Mario and The Legend of Zelda, made very successful transitions from 2D to 3D on the Nintendo 64. Metroid, however, would never see a release on this console. The title Metroid 64 was mentioned a bunch of times in gaming magazines in the late 90s, but there's no conclusive evidence that such a title even entered development at one point. So when in the early 2000s more info came out on a brand new Metroid game, people were hyped but also skeptical. You see, Metroid Prime was developed by the American developer Retro Studios under the guidance of Nintendo. And while many expected the first 3D Metroid to be a third-person adventure game, much like Super Mario 64 and Ocarina of Time, it instead had a first-person perspective. So the new Metroid game was going to be a first-person shooter created by an American developer that's never even put out a game before? Yeah, it's not difficult to imagine why fans of the series were a bit worried. This is just to illustrate that even within its own franchise and subgenre, Metroid Prime was an outlier, and there was no guarantee that this was going to work at all. But when Metroid Prime was finally released for the Nintendo Gamecube on November 18th of 2002, all that skepticism faded immediately. People like Metroid Prime. A lot. The critical reception to Metroid Prime was nothing short of insane. Critics rushed to praise the game in pretty much every area. The music was stunning and perfectly fit the mysterious atmosphere of the game. Then take the visuals. We were only 1 year into the GameCube's existence, and so a game that looked this good while running at a steady 60 FPS, that was pretty special for a console game. The game had succeeded in bringing to life a vision of a mysterious alien planet that commanded many different biomes without compromising the raw performance. Especially back in those days, it always took developers a couple of years to learn how to get the most out of a console's hardware. But Retro Studios set the bar on their first try. Over the course of the GameCube's lifespan, which ended in 2007, there'd be a few games released for the console that looked as good as Metroid Prime, but none that outright surpassed it. The praise for Metroid Prime reached further than just its presentation. More than anything, it was an extremely good adaptation of the Metroidvania formula in a first-person 3D environment. Metroid Prime's success in this department was not a given either. To this day, Metroidvanias are extremely difficult to design. Because the entire game world is interconnected, moving a door at the start of the game may have grave yet unforeseen consequences 8 hours into the game. In the case of Metroid, gaining access to a move as simple as a double jump greatly expands the movement range of the player, and the entire game world has to account for that. Maybe the double jump enables the player to jump over a random wall somewhere, allowing them to skip half the game. This interconnected design makes things much more difficult for developers than when they are just creating a linear sequence of levels, where the upgrade you give to the player in level 5 has no bearing on how they progress through level 3. Apart from a brief prologue on a pirate spaceship, all of Metroid Prime takes place on the planet Talon 4, which can be seen as one big sprawling level divided into many different subsections. And even though some sequence breaks have emerged from the Metroid Prime speedrunning community over the years, if you play through the game normally, it's a fluid experience that consistently ramps up the challenge across its entire runtime. Although it might have been tempting for Retro Studios to lean more into the FPS look of the game and make it a combat-centric experience, Metroid Prime remains true to its roots by making the combat part of the much larger task of navigating through the game world, where puzzle solving and pathfinding are no less centric to the core gameplay loop than defeating enemies. Despite sporting the look of a sci-fi FPS, it was without a doubt still a true Metroid game. Metroid Prime took a huge risk by attempting to execute the series' iconic design philosophy within a 3D environment and from a first-person perspective. It's easy to see why Metroid Prime 64 never materialized. As tricky as it must have been to make Metroid Prime work on the Gamecube, it would have been 10 times as grueling to pull off something similar on the Nintendo 64's much more limited hardware. Just to be clear, Metroid Prime wasn't the first attempt at a first-person Metroidvania. A few years ago, I played a remaster of a game called Power Slave, which was released all the way back in 1996. It too attempted to implement the idea of an interconnected overworld with linear progression in a first-person, sort of 3D environment. I think that Metroid Prime delivered the definite proof that a third dimension doesn't hinder this type of gameplay, but I didn't want to deny Power Slave's rightful place in gaming history. In any case, the success of Metroid Prime can be gauged from its Metacritic score. To this very day, it occupies place 11 on their top-rated games of all time. And while I'll be the first to admit that Metacritic scores don't say everything, Metroid Prime's place on the list is fully deserved and echoed by the reputation the game has among regular gamers to this very day. It's that latter part where things get more interesting. Some games are met with universal praise from critics and normal gamers when they come out, but slowly grow to become seen as excellent products of their time and not as games that you'd really want to revisit in this day and age. I have spent hours upon hours playing GoldenEye on a Nintendo 64, but playing it on my Switch in 2025 is as good a reminder as any that some things are best left in the past. The following may sound as blasphemy to some, but even when playing an iconic game like the first Halo, it is pretty easy for me to notice the shortcomings of its level design. A flaw that was easy to forgive in those days, when FPS games were still fighting for the right to even exist on home consoles in the first place, but a shortcoming that does irk me when I revisit the game today. Yet, Metroid Prime, if anything, has only grown in reputation across the 2 decades that followed its release. It has developed a reputation for having aged particularly well. This reputation is, in part, rooted in the fact that there simply haven't been many games apart from the 2 sequels that have tried to implement Metroid's design philosophy in a similar fashion. After all, the reason that Halo Combat Evolved and especially GoldenEye feel dated now is that many subsequent games took inspiration from those titles and built and improved upon the concepts that they'd helped popularize. There are still plenty of games that took inspiration from Metroid Prime, but those inspirations tend to be more subtle in nature, and there just hasn't been a game that outfoxed Metroid Prime in its own domain. Well, except for maybe Metroid Prime 2, but that's cheating. So, a question you might ask at this point is whether Metroid Prime deserves its reputation as having aged so well on merit, or there just haven't been that many pretenders coming for its throne. That is where the 2023 Switch remaster of Metroid Prime comes in, because this version rids the game of the most obvious indication of its old age, the visuals. The game now looks as modern as you could ask for on the Switch, ranking among the best looking titles on the console, while somehow still running at a solid 60 FPS. Metroid Prime was also made in an age when game developers had not yet reached consensus on how first-person games should control on a gamepad, meaning the original control scheme can feel clunky and unintuitive to modern gamers. The Switch version also addresses this by offering the player several options, one of which is the standard dual analog stick control scheme that we've grown so used to over the years. In erasing these indicators of the game's age, we are able to look at Metroid Prime in a new light and hold it against the games of today to determine whether it still holds up as a gaming experience in 2025, or we've been wearing nostalgia goggles all this time. When I started my replay of Metroid Prime on the Switch, I was instantly hit with a sense of familiarity. A logical sentiment, of course, but one that was strengthened by the way the game starts. The opening sequence of Metroid Prime, in which protagonist Samus Aran blows up a space pirate frigate, has always struck me as the developers reassuring the player, "Don't worry, it's still Metroid." For a moment we see Samus from a third-person perspective, and as we assume control over her, we hear the series' iconic fanfare. Welcome home, Metroid fan. For a first-person game, Metroid Prime has a super detailed 3D model for the main character. This is the apparent result of the decision to have the game play in first person having been made late into the development process. Throughout the game, you can see the developers seizing every opportunity at their disposal to show off this model, almost as if they're flexing. There are even entire sections that take place in third person. You can change into Samus's morph ball form on command, turning you into a lethal pinball that can crawl through tight spaces, blow up enemies and solve puzzles. However, the first person perspective comes across as anything but an afterthought. The heads-up display serves to put you inside Samus's helmet. I know that some people dislike having stuff on their screen in a first-person game, but in the case of Metroid Prime, it's essential to the game experience. As you play, you gain access to different upgrades and visors, such as X-ray vision, and there will be enemies that are able to interfere with the electronics in your visor. Nearly everything in Prime is there to enrich the gameplay. Some players will still dislike the claustrophobic feeling that the helmet display might give you at times, and you can in fact turn off most of the HUD elements. But I would not recommend that unless you're, say, shooting B-roll for a YouTube video. I'd argue that the helmet display is an integral part of the game, since it fits in so well with the task of exploring an alien planet with nothing but some space armor to protect you from the horrors it plays host to. Speaking of which, let's talk about Talon 4, the planet you land on after the prologue mission, and where you'll spend the remainder of the game. Talon 4 fits into the sci-fi trope of a planet with a lost, advanced civilization that is being reclaimed by nature. This vibe is especially strong in the first few sections you explore, which together form the Chozo ruins, the Chozo being an ancient race of bird-like people that once ruled over the planet. If you've been to Ilos in the first Mass Effect game, it's quite similar to that. You later explore other biomes such as the scorching hot magma caverns and the frozen Fendrana drifts, but most of these are connected through the overarching theme of the lost civilization, which helps Metroid Prime retain the feel of an adventure game despite its reliance on FPS mechanics. Immediately, the setting presents us with several questions. What has made the Chozo disappear? And why are the space pirates we fought earlier also present on this planet? It's during these first steps on Talon 4 that we begin piecing together the answers to these questions. In accordance with the overall design of the game, figuring out the story is a bit of a puzzle of itself. Metroid Prime actually tells you very little about what's going on if you don't put in the effort. The few cutscenes that are in the game mostly serve to introduce a new area or reveal a boss enemy, but they feature little to no actual narrative. The bulk of the storytelling is done through your visor, which you can use to scan objects. These objects can be plants, enemies, ancient objects, but also notes, scripts and other data left behind by the Chozo or the recently arrived space pirates. This method of storytelling may not have been new back then, and it certainly does not feel at all revolutionary these days, when we're used to every other bandit leaving behind detailed notes on their evil plans in just about every game that has bandits. But in Metroid Prime, this breadcrumb method of storytelling still works quite well. The reason that it works well is that this more subtle method of exposition enhances the overall gameplay. As I hinted to earlier, with the entire game world being a giant puzzle for you to solve, it only makes sense for the narrative to also be delivered to you in scraps that you have to make an effort to find. These scraps, be they computer logs or dry environmental scanning data, then have to be compared with not just each other, but also with what you see around you. For example, when you read Chozo scripture that talks about a poisonous corruption emerging after a meteor strike, pair it with space pirate logs on harvesting a new volatile source of energy, and you then navigate using your eyes and your map to find the entry points of this poison into the ruins, you gain an understanding of not just where you're supposed to go, but also why you're going there and why the space pirates are trying so desperately to stop you. On a level above that, it also contributes to the overall feeling you get while playing through Metroid Prime. You're exploring this big, hostile world from within the confines of your own spacesuit. There's no omnipresent voiceover to laud your heroic deeds after each boss battle, nor a storyteller to place your actions into an easily digestible narrative structure. There aren't even friendly NPCs to talk to. You're on your own, and you're not leaving until you make the effort to figure out what's going on this planet and do something about it. Personally, I am always a bit skeptical of video game stories. There's so much poorly written dialogue, so many predictable plot twists, and such an abundance of corny, one-dimensional characters that video game stories can often be something I just have to suffer through in order to enjoy the actual game. On the surface, Metroid Prime's story is nothing special either. You spend most of the game trying to get rid of the poison that is corrupting the planet. And when you find out that the space pirates are using that corrupted energy to try and engineer highly powerful super soldiers as well as other juiced up monsters, they have to be dealt with as well. Yet, in Metroid Prime, this story arc is good because it goes hand in hand with the gameplay. As we've seen, the passive storytelling feeds into the sense of discovery that is at the core of the game. When you delve deeper into Talon 4, the threat of the corruption also begins to escalate. Not in the last place because the space pirates are engineering bigger and meaner monsters for you to deal with. Defeating these mutated enemies involves the use of bigger and more powerful weapons, which you find in the form of new modes for your beam weapon, new visor settings, and upgrades to Samus's ball form. All culminating in a final boss battle that has you use all of these abilities. It would go a bit far to label this synergy between gameplay and story a ludonarrative masterpiece, but it is a great example of how a story can be captivating and interesting enough in its own right, while still serving the purpose of delivering a cool and challenging gaming experience. The key to this harmony is how the nature of every building block in a game is designed to complement the other parts. The absence of a bombastic sci-fi narrative feeds into the sense of desolation that the environments inspire, and even the way the heads-up display works is meant to strengthen the illusion that you're really out there exploring a mysterious planet. When you put all the pieces together, you get a game that is impressive in many regards, but at the same time feels subtle and humble about it. It's when I thought about this that I realized that this is not something you often see in big-budget gaming productions these days. When old games get remastered to have modern visuals and other features, you will still have elements from that game that reveal its age. These can be design choices that would nowadays be considered archaic, mechanical limitations, or just the overall concept or tone of the game feeling behind the times. A few months ago I was playing through the definitive edition of Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, the game that was originally released some 2 years after Metroid Prime. Just to get it out of the way, the definitive edition is a great example of how not to do a remaster, with even the visual enhancements not feeling like upgrades much of the time. But beyond my gripes with the lazy remaster, it also struck me just how dated GTA San Andreas is as a game. Missions felt gamey and arcadey in a way that we'd stopped seeing in GTA 4 and 5. While those last two games tried hard to be a sort of black comedy crime drama, the story in San Andreas mostly serves to get you to explore the, by the standards of those days, huge map. Especially in the latter half of the game, the story missions were an assortment of mostly random tasks that required you to master the different aspects of the gameplay, like stealth, flying, and lousy shooting mechanics. Don't get me wrong, it was super fun back in the day, but upon revisiting it after many years, it also became clear to me that you couldn't get away with publishing such an open world game in this day and age. Even Saints Row, a series that had fully embraced the goofy and angsty side of GTA, has come and gone. Point being, you can slap a new coat of paint on an old game, and regardless of how high or low the quality of the paint is, the age of a game will shine through in more than just its presentation. Even in the case of Metroid Prime, there was one particular aspect of the game that made me go, a game would not do this in 2025. That aspect being the pacing. As we've already touched upon, Metroid Prime gives a lot of agency to the player. You are not spoon-fed an overarching narrative to guide you. There are no objective markers, and even basic info like who it is that you are fighting and why is something that you'll have to piece together yourself. This is not to say though that you will constantly be lost. The signposting is generally quite good, meaning that the way forward will for the most part be pretty obvious, even when the game doesn't explicitly tell you where to go. There is also a 3D map of the entire game world that takes a few minutes to get used to, but becomes very useful for keeping track of which areas you've already explored and where you can find the uncharted territory. When you spend some time wandering around, the game will even alert you to suspicious activity in an area that is likely to be where your next objective waits. So there is some guidance, but most of it is relayed to you in a way that doesn't break the immersion nor eliminates the challenge. Even with these tools at your disposal, there are parts where the game will feel a bit slower than what we're used to in this day and age. The more upgrades you unlock, the more you have to start backtracking through areas you've already explored to find the one door or ledge that had up until then been inaccessible. Across the many hours that Metroid Prime takes to beat, it becomes easy to lose track of where you've been and what area you're supposed to explore next. We've seen that there are tools in place to guide you through some of those moments, but when you do get stuck, there's not much else to do than just comb through familiar areas until you find a new thread to pull in the form of a lever, a hidden passageway, or a chasm that you are now able to cross. As you uncover more of the world, more shortcuts will become available that make map navigation easier and shorter, but it can still knock the wind out of your sails when you're on one side of the map and there's a chance you need to be on the other side of the map, but you can't be sure until you actually get there. I should stress that these moments weren't too common during my most recent playthrough, but they did occur, especially in the latter stages of the game when most of the map is available for exploration. Another pace slower was the objective you get during the game to gather 12 Chozo artifacts, which you need in order to unlock the endgame. These artifacts are placed in well-hidden places across the entire game world. Some of them you'll stumble upon as you progress through the game naturally, but for others you'll have to go out of your way to get them. I didn't keep track, but I estimate that gathering all these items added a good hour to the playtime. This method of stretching the game's runtime was fairly common in Nintendo games back in the day. The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker, released around the same time as Metroid Prime, had a notorious fetch quest near the end of the game that just went on for ages and brought the flow of the experience to a grinding halt. By comparison, Metroid Prime's artifact hunt isn't nearly as obnoxious, both because it doesn't take as long and because the game already revolves around backtracking, preventing this sort of objective from sticking out like a sore thumb. The reason I bring up both the Chozo artifacts and the moments of being stuck is because, to me, these were the moments where I noticed Metroid Prime wasn't a modern game, but for different reasons. You see, back in the old days, I didn't really take notice of these pacing inconsistencies, probably because back then, when I just played games on my console, I'd want to savor each game and spend as much time in its world as possible. Many games were designed with this idea in mind, that you'd buy a game and spend a good week or two with just that game, until you had seen every nook and cranny. But times have changed. Now, practically everyone has a digital library, whether it's Steam or something else, that has more games in it than they could hope to beat within the next 20 years. Games are still designed to make you spend a bunch of time with them, but for different reasons. There are so many alternatives out there that developers feel like they're constantly fighting to retain your attention. They need to draw you in with a flashy cinematic trailer and an appealing title. Hence the trend to just call a game like Doom 4, Doom. The first level of the game needs to be spectacular, with a story premise that makes you want to keep playing instead of looking for something else. It's almost like a YouTube video, really. Many games, including single-player games, want you to spend more time in the game, because it increases the chance of you buying DLC or items through microtransactions, which incentivizes gaming companies to create a gameplay loop that rewards you just enough to keep you hooked, but not enough to completely satisfy you. Fire up any Ubisoft game from the past 10 years and you'll see what I mean. Or better yet, don't, because none of that stuff is worth your time or money anyway. So, how would Metroid Prime fit into this current day industry? Had the game been made today, how would it change? These aren't just hypotheticals, as a fourth Metroid Prime game is scheduled to be released this year, and it'll be interesting to see how susceptible the game will be to some of the less savory modern day trends in gaming. Touching back on the occasional sense of feeling lost in Metroid Prime, I suspect that there is a lower tolerance for such moments in the present day, both among developers and, let's be honest, gamers themselves. A Metroid Prime game designed for modern audiences might feature more blatant objective markers, or just be more linear and easy to track in general. We could already see a glimpse of this in the third Metroid Prime, which was released in 2007 for the Wii, and which was already a lot more straightforward and conventional than the first two games in the series, no doubt influenced by the linear cinematic FPS games of the time. Of course, I am generalizing, and I know that there are titles out there, like the Souls games, that take a more minimalistic, intuitive approach to guiding the player. But part of the reason why those games are both successful and notorious is because they serve a specific audience that craves this sort of old school challenge that is so hard to find in modern gaming. This might also be a part of why Metroid Prime is still kept in such high regard, and I'm not sure whether a new Metroid Prime game would aim for that sort of audience anymore. Funnily enough, when I think about collecting the Chozo artifacts, Metroid Prime might actually have been ahead of its time in that department. In pursuing that same goal of making gamers spend as much time in the game as possible, many modern titles have artificially stretched playtimes, with unlocking the true ending of a game often requiring the completion of obnoxious collection quests or other grindy objectives. Had Metroid Prime been under the care of a cynical publisher in 2025, the relatively modest padding at the end of this game would probably have been turned up to 11. I don't know. Let me know if you agree with these observations. But my point is that Metroid Prime can be refreshingly slow, and even those moments where the pace seems a little too gentle, it ultimately serves to make you spend some more time within this beautiful game world, instead of some ulterior motive where the desired end result is you throwing even more money at a game you've already paid for. When trying to answer the question why Metroid Prime aged so well, several of the things we've discussed stick out. For a game to age so well, it needs to be really good in the first place. About that, there's no question. As we've seen, Metroid Prime was received extremely well back when it was originally released, and to this day it tends to be singled out in Gamecube retrospectives as one of, if not the very best game from that console. There was one quality about the game in particular that made it stand the test of time, namely the smart design. Every separate part of the game serves to provide an immersive experience that retains its quality throughout the lengthy campaign. When you look at games from the same era that didn't age as well, it are usually the tacked on, sloppy bits of the game that grow uglier as more time passes. For example, the aforementioned GTA San Andreas features clunky animations, missions that are frustrating because of poorly thought out mechanics, and a story that lacks focus. These issues were all acknowledged at the time, but the audience and critics were much more forgiving due to the, at the time, ambitious scope of the game. As the amount of content in San Andreas was dwarfed by subsequent open world games, its flaws came more to the foreground, to a point where, with the modern eye, it seems a dated game whose legacy consists in pushing open world design forward. Metroid Prime is not a perfect game, but it does come a lot closer than most titles do, and that's what helps it maintain that special aura even now. The core game design is really well thought out, and everything from the storytelling to the pacing and the music feeds into it. Nothing about it feels like an afterthought. Another thing that makes Metroid Prime such a special experience, even in 2025, is that there aren't a whole lot of games that try to do what it did, let alone did it better. That's not to say that Metroid Prime didn't have its fair share of influence. It gave a fine example of how to handle environmental storytelling in a way that is in no way invasive to the player. You can see a lot of that in a game like BioShock, which doesn't quite emulate that same feeling of desolation that Metroid Prime has, but still tells most of its story through what the player sees around them, rather than what is relayed to them in set pieces. Even in the recent and incredible indie shooter Salako, there's a little nod to the helmet face reflection effect you can see during explosions in Metroid Prime. And there are also similarities in some of the level design and atmosphere building. One parallel I've always found fascinating is that between Metroid Prime and Halo. Both Metroid Prime and the first Halo game were developed around the same time, and they built on some of the same ideas while taking those ideas in vastly different directions, with Halo's path being the one that most of the industry would follow. In both games, you could argue that the environment is one of the protagonists. When I think of Metroid Prime, the first thing that comes to mind is exploring the early parts of the Chozo ruins, when the world of Talon 4 seems so overwhelming and unknowable. When Halo comes up, I always have this picture in my head of when you first land on the Halo ring and get that same feeling of this massive world that is just waiting for you to explore it. Of course, the respective ways in which you end up exploring the worlds of Metroid Prime and Halo Combat Evolved are very different. But I do think that both games tap into the same sense of wonder and curiosity that attracts people to these grand sci-fi adventures. There has even been some cross-pollination between their respective sequels, with subsequent Halo games taking the occasional note from Prime's environmental storytelling, while Metroid Prime 3 in particular started exploring the world around Samus, which, given the time frame, has to have been influenced by the world-building approach of the Halo games. This is why I've come to refer to Metroid Prime as Halo for introverts. Don't worry, I am aware that it's a silly way to describe it and it's meant in a lighthearted manner. But it does touch upon what this game is about. Metroid Prime is a solitary, immersive experience that takes place on a grand scale, that speaks to the imagination. In the years following its initial release in 2002, the gaming industry would move more and more towards social online experiences, in a way assuring that Metroid Prime would always remain somewhat of an outlier in the gaming landscape. This limited the scope of its success, but it also allowed the game to continue to occupy a special place in the hearts of all those who played it. There was simply nothing out there that had the potential to override its memory. That is the legacy of Metroid Prime, and that is as close as I can get to capturing why it's still such a fascinating game. To this day, it is a blueprint for all developers who want to create a game that will stand the test of time. Think about what kind of an experience you want to give to your audience, and make sure that every aspect of your game is in service of shaping and enriching that experience. Then you might create something that gamers will still talk about 20 years from now. Alright, that's just about all I have to say on Metroid Prime. I hope I've been able to convey my many thoughts on this game in a manner that makes sense. I'd already planned to get this video out in January, but persistent voice issues kept me from recording this until now, so apologies for the long delay. If you're still here, thank you for watching, and leave a comment with a game from your childhood that you think stood the test of time. If you want to hear me talk more about game design, check out my video on Sulaco, which contains a crash course on the history of FPS design. Or if you want to see me do another deep dive into a Nintendo game, try my video on Hyrule Warriors. Anyway, thanks again and see you next time.